Hi guys, and thanks for tuning in. In tonight's video, we're going to talk about the fascinating hygiene habits of the ancient Egyptians. But before we dive in, if you end up liking this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Get in your comfy place, and let's get started. Imagine living in a world over 3,000 years ago. No running water, no electric toothbrush, and yet you might actually be cleaner than some people today. Ancient Egypt wasn't just about pyramids and pharaohs. It was a civilization obsessed with hygiene, from daily baths in the Nile to scented oils, copper razors, and even the world's first known toothpaste. But here's the twist. Some of their beauty secrets were also dangerously deadly. Bathing in ancient Egypt wasn't just about getting rid of sweat or dust. It was almost a moral duty. Egyptians believed cleanliness was tied to both physical health and spiritual purity. The hotter the climate got, the more they washed. And with daytime temperatures that could make the inside of your sandals feel like a frying pan, you can see why that was important. Wealthier Egyptians had servants bring water from the Nile or from wells, pouring it over them while they stood or sat in large basins. The poor, on the other hand, made do by wading in the river itself. Now, bathing in the Nile, it sounds interesting. It sounds refreshing, until you remember that you're sharing the water with some of the most notorious reptiles in history. Yes, crocodiles. Ancient Egyptians knew the risks. These weren't cartoonish little gators. These were Nile crocodiles, capable of swallowing a goat whole. There's even evidence they respected and feared them enough to mummify crocodiles as offerings to Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of strength and protection. Which means, in a way, you could be having your afternoon scrub while silently praying to the local reptile deity not to turn you into lunch. It was the ultimate mix of spa day and survival sport. And don't forget, the Nile wasn't just a bathtub. It was the main highway for trade, the community water source, and the laundry station. So while you were trying to wash the sweat off, there might be someone upstream beating their clothes against a rock. And let's just say water quality wasn't exactly FDA approved. But here's the other thing. Soap. As we know it, back then, it didn't exist. Instead, they scrubbed themselves with a mixture of animal fat and alkaline salts, like natron, the same magical ingredient they used to mummify the dead. Yes, the ancient Egyptians basically bathed with corpse-preserving powder, but hey, it killed bacteria, so who's complaining? And cleanliness didn't stop at a quick rinse. Some people bathed multiple times a day, especially the elite. The priestly class was particularly fanatical. Ritual purity meant they had to wash several times a day, as if the gods themselves were running a 24-hour hygiene inspection. Now we have to talk about sweat. Ancient Egypt was hot. I mean, really hot. And while they didn't have 24-hour protection roll-ons, they did invent their own deodorant, centuries before the modern stuff. One recipe involved crushing fragrant spices like cinnamon and mixing them with citrus and oil to form a paste they could rub under their arms. Another method, they'd soak little balls of perfumed wax and tuck them into their armpits. Yes, the original scented roll-on was basically a lump of spicy wax melting into your skin all day. The good news? You smelled nice. The bad news? You were essentially cooking yourself in cinnamon fat. But here's where hygiene went beyond survival. It was a major part of Egyptian romance. Looking and smelling good was the ancient equivalent of having a killer dating profile. Poor hygiene could ruin your chances at love faster than you can say King Tut. Perfume wasn't just for masking body odor. It was a social and even romantic signal. Both men and women wore scented oils, often made from lotus and cinnamon. Wealthy women would even wear perfume cones on their heads during banquets, which slowly melted throughout the night, releasing a steady aroma. Imagine flirting across the table while warm, floral-scented fat dripped down your hair. Awkward by our standards, but back then, that was the peak of attractiveness. There are love poems from the New Kingdom period that specifically praise a lover's scent, comparing it to lotus blossoms or freshly poured wine. In other words, your smell could be just as important as your looks when it came to catching someone's eye. Being clean, smooth-skinned, and pleasantly scented was the ancient Egyptian version of swiping right. Of course, smell was only half the equation. In ancient Egypt, looking desirable meant being smooth. Like, really smooth. Hair wasn't just a fashion choice. It was seen as dirty, itchy, and a possible home for lice. And nothing says romance killer like scratching your head during a banquet while your perfume cone melts onto your shoulders. Both men and women often shaved their heads completely, opting for wigs that could be styled, scented, and swapped out depending on the occasion. Wealthy Egyptians had wigs made out of human hair or fine plant fibers, while the less wealthy made do with cheaper versions. But the goal was the same: no natural hair, no pests, no problem. Priests took this to the extreme, shaving their entire bodies every other day. Yes, every other day. Eyebrows, arms, legs, and even spots you'd never expect a copper razor to reach. This wasn't just vanity. It was about ritual purity, so the gods wouldn't be offended by so much as a stray armpit hair. Hair removal tools included copper razors, sharpened flint, and pumice stones. In other words, they were doing full-body hair removal thousands of years before laser treatments, just with more blood and grit involved. And yes, you could still be considered hot, even if your beauty routine involved scraping your scalp with a stone. Once the Egyptians had their skin smooth, hair free, and smelling like a lotus-scented daydream, it was time for the final, and arguably most basic and iconic step: your makeup. And in ancient Egypt, makeup wasn't just about looking good in the candlelight of a palace banquet. It was about health, status, and even spirituality. The most recognizable feature? Kohl eyeliner. Those dramatic black lines sweeping out from the corners of the eyes like the wings of a falcon. It wasn't just for fashion. Made from ground galena, mixed with animal fat or vegetable oils, kohl actually helped protect the eyes from intense sunlight. The dark pigment reduced glare, much like how modern athletes smear black under their eyes. And it went one step further. Those lead-based compounds had antibacterial properties that helped fight off eye infections caused by the ever-present desert dust and the, shall we say, less than pristine Nile River. Both men and women wore kohl. In fact, it was so common that not wearing it might have been the ancient equivalent of showing up to a party without brushing your teeth. You'd look just a little unfinished. While black kohl was the most popular, green eye paints made from crushed malachite were also common, especially during the Old Kingdom. The green wasn't just a style choice. It symbolized rebirth, fertility, and health. In a culture obsessed with the afterlife, wearing green around your eyes wasn't just about looking good today. It was about setting yourself up for good vibes in eternity. They stored these cosmetics in beautifully carved pots, jars, and palettes, some so ornate they could easily pass for luxury art pieces today. Applying makeup was a ritual, often done with the help of servants in wealthier households, and it wasn't rushed. We're talking a whole experience, grinding minerals, mixing them with oils, carefully tracing lines, like a spa day, except every morning. So makeup didn't just stop at the eyes. The Egyptians also used red ochre mixed with fat to color their lips and their cheeks. This was applied with a fingertip or a small stick giving a warm, sun-kissed look that, okay, probably didn't fool anyone in a land where everyone was sun-kissed, but it added the polished, finished appearance that was prized. To keep their skin smooth in the dry desert climate, they used a variety of lotions and creams made from animal fats, beeswax, and plant oils. Many of these were scented with myrrh luxury ingredients that also had antibacterial quantities. Skincare was as much about preventing disease as it was about preventing wrinkles. And of course, not all ancient beauty hacks were safe. Prolonged exposure to lead-based coal could lead to slow lead poisoning, something they wouldn't have understood at the time. And some of their green pigments contained copper, which in high doses can actually be toxic. But still, compared to other ancient civilizations, Egypt's makeup had more practical health benefits than harm, at least in the short term. And here's the kicker. This obsession with makeup crossed all social classes. While the rich had access to finer ingredients and more elaborate containers, even poorer Egyptians used some form of kohl or skin oils. In a land where appearance was tied to cleanliness, health, and divine favor, going barefaced, well, it really wasn't an option. If you think sunscreen is a modern miracle invented to save beach days, ancient Egypt would like to have a word with you. They didn't know about SPF or ultraviolet radiation, but they absolutely understood one thing. The sun in Egypt is not a suggestion. To protect skin from burning and drying into parchment, Egyptians rubbed themselves with oils, pastes, and plant extracts that acted as barriers, moisturizers, and luckily offered a bit of protection from the sun's worst moods. Ingredients mentioned in historical surveys and medical histories include rice bran extracts, jasmine, lotus, and various plant oils, which were used to both prevent tanning and help heal sun-damaged skin. Think of it as pre-SPF. Not perfect, but surprisingly functional for a civilization that hadn't heard of sunscreen bottles. So they could protect their skin and eyes with clever recipes. But the one thing you can't hide with eyeliner is your teeth. Which brings us to toothpaste, toothpicks, and the sorry state of the ancient Egyptian smile. The Egyptians wrote down formulas for tooth cleansing powders and pastes. Think of them as the ancestor of your minty tube. A surviving recipe. It lists exact measures, tiny amounts of rock salt, dried iris, mint, and a pinch of pepper, all crushed into a powder to be mixed with saliva and used on your teeth. Other preparations that show up in archaeological reconstructions include pumice, burnt eggshell, crushed bones or hooves, and other gritty abrasives designed to scour the teeth. In other words, they invented a way to freshen breath and scrub plaque long before fluoride, but they also made your dentist wince a little. Part of the reason these abrasive tooth cleaners were necessary was due to ancient Egyptian food. Bread was a staple, but grinding grain on stone querns inevitably produced tiny amounts of grit and stone into the flour. Over decades, that grit acted like sandpaper against enamel. Archaeologists and dental studies show that tooth wear was widespread in ancient remains, so much wear that it sometimes exposed the pulp and caused chronic dental pain and abscesses. In short, they were scrubbing teeth that were already getting ground down by their diet. The combination of a gritty diet and abrasive pastes cleaned teeth, but also contributed to lifetime wear and dental troubles. Because teeth were often worn or obsessed, ancient Egyptians tried a variety of remedies. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests they used toothpicks, rinses, and medicinal pastes. Ancient medical papers contain recipes to try and ease toothaches, from herbal mouthwashes to topical pastes. It wasn't modern dentistry, but people recognized the problem and worked the remedies they had. So the Egyptians had figured out how to keep their faces flawless, their skin smooth, and their teeth, well, reasonably intact. But there's another side to hygiene that we can't avoid if we're telling the whole story. Because once you finish your bread, your figs, and your honeyed beer, eventually nature calls. And in ancient Egypt, answering that call was a little different than today, unless your modern bathroom is shared with goats and the occasional sandstorm. In wealthier homes, toilets were surprisingly sophisticated. A limestone seat with a hole in the middle, often positioned over a sand-filled jar or a clay pot. After doing their business, sand or earth would be sprinkled over the waste to keep the smell down, a technique not unlike what modern cat owners do for their pets. In poorer households, toilets, well, they were much simpler, sometimes just a clay pot or a dugout pit lined with stones. Public facilities existed in some areas, especially near work sites like pyramids and temples, but they weren't exactly glamorous. You'd get a communal setup, minimal privacy, and if you were lucky, a bit of water for washing afterward. And yes, they had their own version of toilet paper. The most common method? Smooth pieces of pottery shards, sand, or even handfuls of grass. It wasn't exactly the soft, quilted luxury of today, but it got the job done. For the elite, washing with water or scented oils might follow, partly for cleanliness, partly to maintain that all-important social polish. What's fascinating is how this tied into their overall obsession with cleanliness. Even in the bathroom, they were conscious of smells, waste disposal, and ritual purity. After all, in a society where cleanliness was seen as a sign of civilization, you didn't want your household to be remembered for, let's just say, the wrong scent. Once the waste was out of the household, the question became, well, where does it all go? In cities like Memphis, sanitation was a constant challenge. The ancient Egyptians didn't have underground sewer systems like the Romans would later develop, but they did have a surprisingly organized approach to waste management, especially in densely populated areas. Laborers or servants were often tasked with emptying waste jars and pits, hauling them outside the city walls, and dumping them in designated refuse areas. In rural villages, waste was often buried in pits away from homes, or used as a fertilizer for crops. Yes, ancient recycling at its most aromatic. The Nile itself played a complicated part in sanitation. On one hand, its flowing water helped carry away some waste. On the other, people bathed, washed clothes, and sometimes dumped refuse into the same river. This meant that upstream cleanliness mattered a lot, and in a culture where water was also sacred, there was a level of care about how it was used. Still, public health, in the modern sense, was more about avoiding bad smells and visible filth than about understanding microscopic germs. Even though they didn't know about bacteria, many Egyptian practices indirectly reduced disease risk. Nature-based cleaning, frequent bathing, hair removal, and perfumed oils all help to limit parasites and skin infections. Waste disposal outside living areas kept dangerous contamination at a safer distance, though not always far enough to stop outbreaks entirely. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages shows streets kept relatively clear of refuse, suggesting that sanitation was not just a personal matter, but it was a community responsibility. And while some of these measures were rooted in religious and ritual beliefs, they had real public health benefits. In the Egyptian worldview, filth was more than unpleasant. It was symbolic of chaos, the opposite of the cosmic order. Keeping yourself and your surroundings clean wasn't just about comfort or vanity. It was a moral duty. And that's why, from the gilded halls of palaces to the humble mud brick houses of farmers, hygiene and waste management was part of what made them feel truly civilized. Of course, keeping the streets clean was only half the battle. After all, no matter how spotless your courtyard or shiny your limestone toilet seat, it's what goes into your body that really counts. And in ancient Egypt, hygiene didn't stop at the bathroom door. It followed you straight into the kitchen. For most households, the kitchen wasn't a separate room with countertops and cabinets. It was often an open-air space in the courtyard or on the roof, where smoke could drift away. The heart of the kitchen was the clay or brick oven, sometimes sunken into the ground, where bread was baked fresh every day. And bread wasn't just a side dish, it was the cornerstone of the Egyptian diet. But here's the thing. Milling grain in stone querns inevitably left tiny fragments of grit in the flour, so careful food production mattered. Good cooks knew to sift the flour to reduce the amount of stone dust. In wealthier homes, servants could spend hours sieving grain, washing produce, and fetching clean water before the cooking even began. Water hygiene was a big deal in a land where the Nile was both life-giver and potential contaminator. Drinking water was usually drawn from the river or canals and stored in large clay jars called zir. To make it more pleasant and possibly safer, it was sometimes filtered through cloth to remove silt, then cooled through evaporation. In some cases, herbs were added to help sweeten the water. This was especially important for beer making, since beer was a staple drink for everyone from farmers to pharaohs. Cooks and bakers in Egyptian society, particularly in temples and palaces, were expected to be exceptionally clean. Religious rules often required temple kitchen workers to wash before preparing offerings for the gods. Hair was kept short or shaved to avoid falling into the food, and scented oils doubled as moisturizers and mild insect repellents. Priestly bakers, in particular, were known to follow strict cleansing routines before baking bread or beer for ritual use. Without refrigeration, Egyptians relied on drying, salting, and sealing food in jars to keep them edible. Meat and fish were preserved with generous amounts of salt or dried in the sun. Fruits were often turned into date paste or dried figs. To keep pests away, storerooms were elevated or sealed with mud plaster, and certain herbs, like mint, were believed to help deter insects. But here's the fascinating part. Much of this food hygiene was intertwined with religious belief. The gods were thought to deserve only the purest, cleanest food, and since temple offerings often paralleled the meals of the elite, the same standards trickled down into everyday cooking habits. In other words, spiritual cleanliness and food cleanliness were two sides of the same coin. So when an ancient Egyptian family sat down to a meal, bread, beer, grilled fish, and fresh vegetables, there was an entire unseen web of hygiene practices behind it: grinding, sieving, filtering, washing, preserving, that kept the food not only tasty, but safe. And while they didn't have germ theory, their blend of practical measures and ritual discipline meant they were far from careless about what ended up on their plates. Now, once the bread was baked, the beer brewed, and the fish grilled to perfection, there was still one last hygiene hurdle before you could charm your dinner guests: your breath. And in ancient Egypt, just like today, nobody wanted to be remembered as the person with the afterlife breath. Without toothbrushes as we know them, and with all that gritty bread wearing teeth down, bad breath could be a problem. So the Egyptians, well, they got creative. They made small, chewable pastilles, basically the ancient world's breath mints. So they made these breath mints by mixing frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and honey, and then forming the mixture into little pellets. These ingredients weren't just chosen for flavor. Frankincense and myrrh have mild antiseptic properties, while cinnamon can help mask strong odors. Some recipes even included herbs like parsley or mint leaves, which were chewed fresh to sweeten the breath. Temple workers and the elite were particularly fond of these little luxuries, not just for personal comfort, but because in a society obsessed with social grace, a pleasant scent wasn't optional. It was a requirement. So what does all of this tell us? Hygiene in ancient Egypt wasn't a side note. It was a central part of daily life, woven into everything from religion to romance. They bathed often, sometimes in the Nile itself, even sharing those waters with crocodiles. They invented deodorant before the concept had even had a name. They shaved their bodies smooth and wore wigs to avoid lice. They lined their eyes not just to look beautiful, but to protect against sun and infection. They made their own toothpaste, handled waste with surprising care, and even approached cooking and food storage with a sharp eye for cleanliness. And when the day was done, they finished it all off with a dab of oil, a sweep of coal, and if they were smart, a breath mint made from the finest spices in the land. In short, the ancient Egyptians didn't just build pyramids. They built a culture where looking good, smelling good, and staying clean was as important as pleasing the gods themselves. It was health, beauty, and spirituality all rolled into one, and in many ways, the echoes of those practices are still with us today. Now, all this talk about perfumed oils, custom wigs, and delicately carved cosmetic jars might have you picturing every Egyptian as a runway-ready noble living their best life by the Nile. But let's be honest, most people weren't bathing in imported lotus oil while nibbling on figs under a palm tree. The vast majority of ancient Egyptians were farmers, laborers, or craftsmen, and their daily hygiene routines were, let's just say, simpler. No makeup pots, no silver-handled razors, more like a clay jar, a riverbank, and whatever you could get your hands on before your children spilled it in the dirt. For a poorer family, the day often started before the sun even peeked over the horizon. Why? Because you wanted to get things done before the Egyptian sun turned your courtyard into something between an oven and a punishment. The first wash of the day might be a quick splash from a water jar, drawn from the Nile the day before, and hopefully not shared with the chickens. Natron soap? Probably too expensive for daily use, so it was often reserved for special occasions or for scrubbing up after especially grimy work. Breakfast wasn't a sit-down feast. It was more like grabbing some leftover bread and beer. Yes, beer for breakfast, but don't judge. It was often safer than the water. Before heading to the fields, workshop, or market. And while wealthier Egyptians could take their time with scented oils and perfumes, the poor might rely on the more practical form of deodorant, working far away enough from others that nobody noticed. Still, even with limited resources, poorer families followed the cultural standard of staying as clean as possible. That meant rinsing off dust and sweat in the Nile whenever they could, shaving hair short to avoid lice, and keeping food and water covered to protect against pests. It might not have been glamorous, but in a land where cleanliness was tied to social respectability, even a humble farmer could look presentable, at least until the afternoon heat turned everyone into a walking human incense cone. After that quick wash and a grab-and-go breakfast of beer and bread, the adults were off to work. For many, that meant heading to the fields to tend wheat and barley, or to care for livestock. Others might work in construction crews, weaving workshops, or as market vendors. The kids? They'd either tag along to help or be left to run minor errands like fetching water from the Nile, which in August probably felt like hauling liquid gold. Bathing in the morning was quick and functional, no time for a full spa treatment. And since natron was a luxury, people often used just plain water, maybe with a scrap of rough cloth for scrubbing. For the especially pragmatic, the morning rinse was less about getting truly clean and more about making the day's sweat start from a fresh base. By late morning, the Egyptian sun was less warm and golden and more giant celestial death lamp. Work slowed down, and people sought shade wherever possible. In villages, this was often under palm trees or in the narrow alleys between mud brick houses. Sweat was inevitable. Without scented oils, poorer families improvised, sometimes rubbing their skin with whatever plant oils were affordable. Olive or castor oil if they could get it, and animal fat if they couldn't. These oils not only helped with dry skin, but also provided a thin barrier against the sun's burn. Yeah, it was basically ancient sunscreen, minus the SPF rating. Lunch was usually bread, onions, maybe a little fish, and surprise, more beer. And here's where hygiene crept back in. Even poorer families tried to wash their hands before eating, especially if they'd been working in the fields or handling animals. Water was poured from a jar over the hands, with the runoff collected in a basin, because wasting water in Egypt was practically a crime against common sense. After lunch, work resumed until late afternoon, when the heat began to relent. This was a good time to head to the river for a quick dip. It wasn't exactly a private experience. You'd be bathing alongside your neighbors, kids splashing, women washing clothes, and someone's goat standing far too close for comfort. Still, it was refreshing, and it was one of the few moments in the day that felt communal and restorative. For poorer Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a source of water. It was the neighborhood bathroom, laundromat, and social club, all in one. And yeah, crocodiles were a concern, but as long as you stayed in shallow, busy areas, you were probably safe. Back home, the family gathered for the evening meal, which might be heartier than lunch if they'd had a good day. More bread, lentils, vegetables, maybe some salted fish or dates for dessert. After eating, there was usually a bit of personal grooming. Short hair trimmed with a knife, nails cleaned with a sliver of wood or bone, and for those who could afford it, a dab of inexpensive perfume made from local herbs. Before bed, families often poured water over themselves one last time, more to cool off than to actually get clean. And then it was time to sleep, either inside on mats made of woven reeds, or in the hotter months on the flat roof under the stars. So while they didn't have alabaster basins, imported oils, or scented cones melting artfully down their wigs, poor Egyptians still lived by the same cultural ideal: a clean body, a tidy home, and a pleasant scent were marks of respectability. They might not have sparkled with like the nobility, but they knew how to stay clean enough to face the gods and their neighbors. Okay, so now you know all about a day in the life of a poorer person living in ancient Egypt. But now are you wondering about how a rich person lived? Well, you're in luck. Let's talk about it. While the poorer family was already in the fields before sunrise, the wealthy Egyptian might still be waking up in a cool, shaded bedroom, walls painted with bright murals, floor mats woven from fine reeds, and maybe a servant fanning them with palm fronds. Their bedding? Linen sheets, because cotton wasn't in Egypt yet, but linen was the gold standard of comfort. The day began not with a splash from a clay jar, but with water poured by a servant into a polished alabaster basin. And it wasn't just any water. It had often been filtered, cooled overnight in porous clay jars, so it felt like a Nile breeze in liquid form. First order of business is bathing. A wealthy Egyptian could afford to bathe more than once a day, using natron-based cleansing mixtures blended with fragrant oils. Servants might massage scented ointments into the skin afterward. Lotus, myrrh, cinnamon, turning the morning routine into a mini spa session. Hair removal was meticulous. Copper razors, or bronze tweezers kept them smooth. And if they wore wigs, those wigs were carefully styled, perfumed, and sometimes decorated with beads or gold threads. Even their nails were buffed and polished, because in ancient Egypt, good grooming wasn't just personal pride, it was social currency. Instead of grabbing a chunk of leftover bread and beer, the wealthy might start their day with fresh fruit, honey-sweetened bread, and a light beer or wine. And yes, they'd wash their hands beforehand, often with perfumed water poured by servants into decorative bowls. The runoff whisked away so the table stayed pristine. As the sun climbed high, the wealthy didn't need to hide under the palm trees. They had thick, walled houses designed to keep rooms cool. Work, if any, was administrative, overseeing estates, managing trade, or holding meetings. They might apply extra scented oils as a midday freshen-up, and if the day involved going outside, a group of attendants kept the sun at bay. Lunch could be more elaborate. Freshly caught fish, roasted goose, figs, melons, and plenty of beer or wine. All food would be prepared by servants who adhered to strict temple-like hygiene standards: shaved heads, clean clothing, and carefully washed hands. While the poorer family returned to the fields or the river, the wealthy might spend the afternoon playing board games, listening to music, or taking short boat trips on the Nile for some fresh air. If they swam, it was likely in a private pool or a carefully chosen stretch of the river, far from laundry and livestock. Servants kept towels, oils, and clean garments ready for when they stepped out. As the day cooled, preparations for the evening began. This was prime time for another bath, reapplication of perfumes, and a touch of makeup, black kohl eyeliner, red lips, maybe green malachite eyeshadow for extra flair. Wealthy women would place a perfumed cone on their wigs, letting it slowly melt throughout the banquet so their scent stayed fresh all night. Banquets were social theaters of hygiene. Guests reclined on cushioned chairs, while servants offered bowls for hand washing before and after meals. Food was abundant and displayed beautifully, and the air was filled with the aroma of incense. Bad breath? Not an option. Wealthy guests often nibbled on those honey and spice pastilles to ensure they were socially flawless. The evening might end with music, dance, and more wine before retreating to bed in a room cool from the day's shade. Linens were fresh, wigs were removed, skin was still soft from oils, and tomorrow would bring another day of meticulous grooming. For the wealthy, hygiene wasn't just about staying clean. It was a performance, a visible marker of status. Where the poor aimed to be clean enough, the rich aimed to be so clean, even the gods would compliment you. All right, you guys, now you know just as much about ancient hygiene as I do. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a like and subscribe. And for those of you still awake, I'll tend to the fire a little bit longer, hoping the sounds of the fire will put you to sleep. Until next time, see you later.